Hazard analysis and critical control point, HACCP, is a way of managing food safety hazards. In this module, you will learn the origins of HACCP, who uses it, and how the 7 HACCP principles promote good safety practices in the food industry. HACCP was first used during a collaboration between NASA, the US Army laboratories and the Pillsbury companies in the 1960s. Their task was to produce safe food for astronauts to consume on their expeditions. In order to do this, they devised a food production system based on NASA's Critical Control Points, or CCP system, which they had used with success in engineering context. Pillsbury was the first food manufacturing company to adopt an HACCP plan and held the first formal HACCP training sessions in 1972. HACCP was officially defined by the World Health Organization, or WHO, in the 1990s and has been adopted by countries around the world. HACCP has been a legal requirement in the UK food industry since 2006. It is compulsory under EC Regulation 852/2004, which is sometimes referred to as the HACCP law. Catering, food retail and food manufacturing businesses must all abide by these rules. In brief, HACCP involves conducting a hazard analysis, identifying critical control points, known as CCPs, establishing critical limits, drawing up reliable monitoring procedures and systems, establishing corrective actions, establishing reliable verification processes, and implementing reliable record-keeping processes. A good HACCP plan helps you spot problems before they compromise food safety and enables you to take suitable measures to correct them. The first step is to undertake a thorough hazard analysis. A hazard is something that is dangerous. In this case, it is something that may make food unsafe or unfit to eat. There are 3 main types of food safety hazards you should consider: microbiological hazards, which involve harmful bacteria, chemical hazards, which involve chemical contamination, and physical hazards, which involve objects getting into food. If you don't have the sufficient knowledge and experience necessary in order to conduct a hazard analysis, you have a responsibility to seek external guidance. For instance, you may need to hire a health and safety expert with expertise in the food industry sector. The hazard analysis stage consists of 2 steps. The first step, hazard identification, can be regarded as an ideas sharing session. During this step, the people conducting the assessment review the ingredients used in the product, the activities conducted at each step in the process, the equipment used, and how the final product will be stored or distributed and its intended use. The second step is hazard evaluation. You must decide which potential hazards to include in the HACCP plan. Evaluate the severity of each potential hazard and how likely it is to cause harm. Think about the seriousness of the consequences of exposure to the hazard. For example, you may need to consider the risk of a consumer contracting an illness after eating some undercooked food. You should consider both long-term and short-term effects of a potential hazard. These guidelines are broad. This is intentional. HACCP principles are intended for use at every stage and in all areas within the food industry, and thus they need to be flexible. We will look at each of the remaining stages in turn as we move through the course. In the next module, you will learn how to identify critical control points and establish critical limits. In this module, we will look at the second and third principles underlying HACCP. The second HACCP principle is concerned with critical control points. A CCP is defined as a step at which control can be applied and is essential in order to prevent or eliminate a food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. You must address potential hazards that are reasonably likely to cause illness or injury if they are not properly controlled. CCPs are located at any step where hazards can be prevented, eliminated or reduced to acceptable levels. Examples of CCPs may include cooking, chilling, testing ingredients for chemical residues, product formulation control, and testing a product for metal contaminants. CCPs must be carefully developed and documented. In addition, they must only be used for the purposes of product safety. For example, a specified heat process at a given time and temperature that is designed to destroy a specific microbiological pathogen could be a CCP. Different facilities preparing similar food items can differ in the hazards identified and the steps that are CCPs. This can be due to differences in each facility's layout, equipment, selection of ingredients, and the processes employed. The next principle pertains to the use of critical limits. A critical limit is a maximum and/or minimum value to which a biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled at a CCP in order to prevent, eliminate, or reduce to an acceptable level the occurrence of a food safety hazard. A critical limit is used to distinguish between the safe and unsafe operating conditions at a CCP. Each CCP will have one or more control measures to assure that the identified hazards are prevented, eliminated, or reduced to acceptable levels. Each control measure has one or more associated critical limits. Critical limits may be based upon factors such as temperature, time, physical dimensions, humidity, moisture level, pH, salt concentration, preservatives, or sensory information such as aroma or visual appearance. Critical limits must be scientifically based. Each CCP should be based on at least one criterion for food safety. An example of a criterion is a specific temperature in the cooking process that is required in order to reduce the levels of salmonella, a bacterium that can cause food poisoning. The critical limits and criteria for food safety may be derived from sources such as regulatory standards and guidelines, literature surveys, experimental result, and experts. For example, take the process of cooking raw beef burgers. A hazard analysis may identify pathogens as significant biological hazards. Cooking is the step in the process at which control can be applied in order to reduce these pathogens to an acceptable level. To ensure that an acceptable level is consistently achieved, accurate information is needed on the probable number of pathogens in the raw patties, their heat resistance, the factors that influence the heating of the patties, and the area of the patty that heats the slowest. Taken together, all this information can then form a scientific basis for critical limits. In this example, basic research on cooking temperatures may show that cooking the patty at 155 degrees Fahrenheit for 16 seconds would be necessary in order to assure product safety. Having established the CCPs, the next step is to decide how they will be monitored. In the next module, we will look at the monitoring process and how you can implement corrective actions if necessary. Once you have identified hazards, established CCPs, and decided on critical limits, the next stage in the HACCP process is to establish monitoring procedures and corrective actions. We will look at these steps in this module. Monitoring is a planned sequence of observations or measurements to assess whether a CCP is under control. It allows you to produce an accurate record for future use in verification. Monitoring serves three main purposes. Firstly, it is essential to food safety management as it facilitates the tracking of operations. If monitoring indicates that there is a trend towards loss of control, then action can be taken in order to bring the process back into control before a deviation from a critical limit occurs. Secondly, monitoring is used to determine when there is a loss of control and a deviation occurs at a CCP. That is, when a measurement is exceeding or not meeting a critical limit. When a deviation occurs, an appropriate corrective action must be taken. Thirdly, it provides written documentation for use in verification. If a process is not properly controlled, the food may not be safe to eat. Due to the potentially serious consequences of a deviation from critical limits, monitoring procedures must be carefully devised and implemented. Ideally, monitoring should be continuous. For example, the temperature and time for a scheduled freezing process can be continually recorded on temperature recording charts. If the temperature rises above the scheduled temperature, or the time is insufficient as recorded on the chart, you can take immediate corrective action. Individuals responsible for monitoring processes must be trained in the monitoring technique for which they are responsible, fully understand the purpose and importance of monitoring, be unbiased in monitoring and reporting, and accurately report the results of monitoring. The HACCP system for food safety management is designed to identify health hazards and to establish strategies to prevent, eliminate, or reduce their occurrence. However, ideal circumstances do not always prevail, and deviations from established processes may occur. An important purpose of corrective actions is to prevent foods that may be hazardous from reaching consumers. Where there is a deviation from established critical limits, corrective actions are necessary. This is the fifth HACCP principle. Corrective actions should determine and correct the cause of non-compliance, determine the disposition of the non-compliant product, and record the corrective actions that have been taken. Specific corrective actions should be developed in advance for each CCP and included in the HACCP plan. As a minimum, the HACCP plan should specify what should be done when a deviation occurs, who is responsible for implementing the corrective actions, and that a record of the actions taken will be developed and maintained. Individuals who have a thorough understanding of the process, product, and HACCP plan should be assigned the responsibility of overseeing the corrective actions. As appropriate, experts may be consulted in order to review the information available and to assist in the disposal and assessment of the qualities of non-compliant products. Although monitoring and corrective actions allow you to quickly identify any problems and take steps in order to get the operations back on track, they do not provide all the information that you need in order to ensure that the HACCP system is working properly. In order to do this, you need to implement verification processes and keep comprehensive records. We will look at these principles in the next module. The sixth and seventh HACCP principles are verification and record keeping. In this module, you will learn how to check that a system is working properly and how to keep appropriate records. Verification is defined as those activities, other than monitoring, that determine the validity of the HACCP plan and that the system is operating according to the plan. These processes should take place during the development and implementation of the HACCP plans and maintenance of the HACCP system. Information needed to validate the HACCP plan often includes expert advice, scientific studies, in-plant observations, measurements and evaluations. For example, validation of the cooking process for beef patties should include the scientific justification of the heating times and temperatures needed in order to obtain an appropriate destruction of pathogenic microorganisms, and studies to confirm that the conditions of cooking will deliver the required time and temperature to each beef patty. There should be factors built into the plan that would initiate or trigger a review. Examples include changes in raw materials or product formulation, the introduction of a new product, a change of raw materials supplier, a change in the processing system, changes in legislation, reports from the marketplace that indicate a health or spoilage risk, and the emergence of a new foodborne pathogen that could place members of the public at risk. In addition, all HACCP plans should have a scheduled review built into them. This should take place at a prescribed time interval, even if nothing has changed. As an absolute minimum, this should be done annually and cover all areas of the HACCP plan. Any changes should be recorded, and a risk analysis should be carried out to ensure that the HACCP plan is still capable of producing safe food. Once a review has taken place, it must be documented even if nothing has changed. Those individuals responsible for carrying out a review need to ensure that the proposed change does not adversely affect conclusions reached in the HACCP study and thus compromise product safety, and that the HACCP study is kept up to date. The seventh HACCP principle is documentation and record keeping. HACCP records must include a summary of the hazard analysis, including the rationale behind determining hazards and control measures. You must keep detailed records of your HACCP plan. Specifically, it must include a list of people who worked on the plan and their assigned responsibilities, along with a description of the foods processed, their distribution, and their intended use. You should provide a verified flow diagram showing how you identify and manage hazards. You will also need to write an HACCP plan summary table. This should describe your CCPs, critical limits, monitoring processes, corrective actions, verification procedures, verification schedule, and record keeping procedures. You need to record who is responsible for assessments, monitoring, record keeping, and all other activities that make up the plan. There is no universal guidance dictating how long you must keep records. It depends on the nature of your business operations. For example, if you store products with a long shelf life, it makes sense to keep records for at least the duration of their lifespan. Finally, you should also note that the production of safe food products requires that the HACCP system is built upon a solid foundation of prerequisite programs. Common prerequisite programs may include, but are not limited to, cleaning and sanitation, suitable equipment, suitable facilities, supplier control, and general food hygiene principles. Let's review what you've learned in this course. Firstly, we looked at the origins of the HACCP approach, the 7 basic principles that underlie it, and the importance of carrying out a hazard analysis. Next, you learned about setting CCPs and establishing critical limits, and how these play a role in maintaining food safety. We then looked at how you can monitor food operations, and when and how to implement corrective actions in the event that something goes wrong. Finally, you have learned how to record details of your HACCP plan, how and when to review it, and how verification processes enable you to check that the system is working as it should.